in a forgotten corner of Montana, where the wind rattles through broken shutters and the earth remembers every footstep. An 8-year-old girl scrubbed dishes in water so cold it split the skin on her hands. Her sweater hung loose, 2 sizes too big, her small shoulders trembling under the weight of work no child should carry. At her feet lay Kaiser, a German shepherd whose ribs pressed against his coat, yet whose eyes never left the door. He was her fortress, her only shield against the world's cruelty. Each night, she tore small pieces of bread from her plate, slipping them under the table so Kaiser wouldn't go hungry. She risked punishment for him, but she knew he would have done the same for her. What neither of them knew was that someone from the past, a soldier bound by loyalty and a promise left unfulfilled, was about to return. And with him, truths would be unearthed, chains of cruelty broken, and a family reforged not by blood, but by love and second chances. The farmhouse sagged against the Montana wind as though time itself had been gnawing at its bones. The roofline dipped under decades of neglect, and the shutters on the upstairs windows clattered with every gust. Inside, the kitchen was a place where warmth rarely lingered. The stove had gone cold hours ago, leaving the air heavy with the damp scent of old wood and dishwater. At the sink, Sophie Hayes stood on a wobbly wooden stool. She was only 8, but her thin frame looked even smaller against the towering counter. The sweater she wore hung 2 sizes too big, its sleeves frayed and darkened, with stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. It clung to her shoulders, damp where drops of icy water had splashed, soaking into the wool. Her hands moved mechanically in the basin, red and cracked from being plunged too long into water that was more frost than warmth. Every time she wrung out a dish rag, her knuckles split a little deeper, tiny rivulets of raw skin showing through. Sophie barely flinched. Pain had become so common it was almost ordinary, like the creak of the house in the wind or the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. She was humming quietly, though the tune broke every so often, swallowed by fatigue. Her breath fogged faintly above the sink, proof that the kitchen was colder than any place meant for a child. In the corner, Kaiser, the German shepherd, lay on his side. His ribs showed beneath his sable coat, each rise and fall of breath, carving valleys into his flanks. The fur around his ears and chest was still thick, proud even, but hunger had stripped away his weight. He watched Sophie with eyes that were both fierce and weary, the eyes of a soldier who would never abandon his post. Every scrape of chair, every whisper of wind through the cracked window made his ears twitch. When Sophie bent to place a plate on the drying rack, her stomach growled audibly. She pressed a hand against it quickly, embarrassed, though there was no one there to scold her for that particular sound. She glanced toward the door anyway, half expecting her aunt's sharp voice to come slicing through the silence. No voice came. Only Kaiser's low exhale, warm and steady, the sound of a living shield. Sophie paused, eyes darting toward the loaf of bread on the counter. It was yesterday's bread, hard at the edges but still edible. Miriam, her aunt, kept it rationed, reminding Sophie often that food doesn't grow on trees for useless mouths. Sophie knew what that meant. She and Kaiser were both mouths that cost too much. She bit her lip, hesitating. Then, with quick fingers, she tore off a piece no bigger than her palm. She slipped it into her pocket, the motion small and furtive, like a thief. Her eyes darted once more toward the doorway, her chest tightening as if Miriam might materialize from thin air. Kaiser's ears perked. His nose twitched, catching the faint scent. Sophie gave him the smallest of smiles, the kind only children who've learned to keep secrets can make. She dried her hands hastily on her sweater, stepped down from the stool, and crouched near the table. Her knees pressed into the cold linoleum as she pulled the bread from her pocket and slid it under the table leg where Kaiser lay. The shepherd's head lifted with dignified restraint. He didn't lunge. Instead, he sniffed once, then leaned forward, teeth brushing gently against Sophie's fingers as he took the offering. The contact sent a warmth through her that no fire could match. She giggled quietly, more breath than sound, and stroked the fur between his ears. "Good boy," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but sweet. Kaiser chewed slowly, as if savoring not just the food, but the ritual itself. His amber eyes softened when he looked at Sophie, and for a moment, the two of them were the only family that mattered. She sat there for a little while longer, knees aching against the cold floor, hands resting on his side. She could feel the ridges of his ribs beneath her palms. It frightened her, how thin he'd become. Sometimes, when Miriam was especially cruel, she threatened to get rid of him. Sophie never asked where "get rid of" meant. She didn't need to. The fear of losing him was enough to keep her silent, enough to push her small body through endless chores, her only bargaining chip for his survival. Above them, the rafters groaned. A draft slipped through the cracks in the window, brushing against Sophie's damp hair until she shivered. She pressed closer to Kaiser, seeking warmth from his body, and he shifted so that his flank pressed against her shoulder. Her gaze drifted to the far wall, where a family portrait once hung. Only a nail remained, rusted and bent, the picture long gone. Sophie remembered it vividly, her father in his police uniform, her mother smiling proudly, Sophie herself in a blue dress with white lace trim. Kaiser had been in that photo too, still young, ears too big for his head, tongue lolling as he leaned into her father's leg. She squeezed her eyes shut against the memory. It hurt too much to hold it, but still, it was the memory that fed her when bread was scarce, the thing that kept her moving when her hands bled. From outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters like fists. Sophie startled, and Kaiser instantly lifted his head, ears forward, eyes locked on the door. His growl was low, steady, the sound of warning. Sophie froze, one hand still buried in his fur. No one entered. The wind died down again, leaving only silence. Kaiser lowered his head, but the tension in his body remained. Always on guard, always ready. Sophie climbed back onto the stool, returning to the basin. She picked up another plate, her fingers stiff from the cold, her chest tight from fear. But there was a quiet strength in the rhythm of her work, in the presence of the dog who never let the shadows come too close. She whispered to herself as she scrubbed, not daring to speak loud enough for the walls to hear. One day, it'll be better. One day. Kaiser's tail brushed once against the floor, as if he'd heard and agreed. The farmhouse sighed around them, its bones groaning under another Montana winter. But within its broken walls, there was a flicker of defiance. A girl and her dog, fragile in body, but unyielding in spirit, holding back the darkness with nothing but cracked hands, hungry eyes, and a bond that refused to be broken. The farmhouse held its chill like a grudge. Even when the stove burned, the warmth rarely spread far. It lingered near the iron belly of the firebox and left the rest of the house in shadows and drafts. Tonight, the stove was cold, a pan of grey water sitting where supper should have been. The front door slammed against the frame, and the sound travelled through the kitchen like a shot. Sophie flinched, nearly dropping the stub of pencil in her hand. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the corner of a worn notebook balanced against her knees. A child should be useful if she's going to take up space. Miriam's voice cut through the house. Sophie froze. Her aunt's footsteps followed, hard and quick across the warped floorboards. Miriam appeared in the kitchen doorway, her coat draped over one arm, a cigarette pinched between two fingers. She was a thin woman in her late 40s, her face hollowed by bitterness more than age. Her auburn hair, streaked with gray at the roots, was pulled too tight from her temples, giving her the sharp look of someone always on the verge of snapping. Her eyes swept the room and found Sophie immediately. "There you are," Miriam said. She flicked ash into the sink without care. "Sitting on the floor again, like a stray dog. What's that you've got?" Sophie hugged the notebook to her chest, silent. Miriam sneered. "Drawing. While dishes sit in the basin. Bread doesn't buy itself, girl. Food doesn't grow on trees. God knows I've got enough mouths to feed in this house." Her voice rose with each phrase, shrill and cutting. From the corner, Kaiser shifted. His paws slid across the linoleum as he rose, his eyes trained on Miriam. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep and steady. The sound filled the kitchen, an invisible wall between Sophie and her aunt. Miriam's lips thinned, her hand twitching at her side. "That mutt ought to be put down," she spat. "Useless as you are, eats more than he's worth." Sophie's arms tightened around the notebook. "He's not useless," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miriam didn't hear, or chose not to. She dropped her coat onto the chair, lit her cigarette, and exhaled smoke that curled bitter and sour in the air. "You'd best get used to hard truth, girl. Life isn't drawings and pets. It's work. It's scraping by." Kaiser's growl deepened. His ears were sharp points, his body taut with warning. "Quiet him down," Miriam snapped, flicking ash dangerously close to the rug. "Or one of these nights, he'll find himself gone." The words landed like stones in Sophie's chest. She pressed her lips shut to keep them from trembling. With a trembling hand, she reached back and touched Kaiser's head. The contact was enough. His growl lowered, but his gaze stayed locked on Miriam, unflinching. Miriam muttered something about ungrateful brats and stomped off toward the parlor, the sound of her heels clattering against the wood until it faded. Only when the house grew quiet again did Sophie release the breath she'd been holding. She eased the notebook open, her pencil hovering above the page. On the paper was a drawing half-finished, her mother's smile. The lines were careful, though shaky, her small hand struggling to capture the curve of her face. In the corner of the page, another sketch. Her father's strong jaw, his uniform shirt sketched in heavy strokes. Kaiser was there too, drawn beside them, bigger than life, his tail wagging like she remembered from before everything went wrong. She had started this drawing weeks ago, but always stopped midway, afraid that finishing it might erase the memory itself. She whispered, so softly only Kaiser could hear, "I don't want to forget them." Her mind drifted to the night the sheriff came to the door 3 years ago, hat in hand, his voice shaking as he told them what had happened. Her parents had been gunned down in an ambush by a mafia crew her father had been investigating. Her mother, who had been driving to pick him up from the precinct, was caught in the crossfire. The memory came in fragments, the weight of silence in the room, the way her mother's badge glinted in the lamplight when they returned it, the sound of Kaiser whining against the door, waiting for footsteps that would never come back. Sophie closed her eyes, letting tears pool, but refusing to let them fall. She pressed the notebook tighter to her chest and crawled toward her bed. The mattress sagged in the corner, its blanket thin and frayed. She lifted it carefully, sliding the notebook underneath where Miriam would not think to look. The drawings were her secret, her proof that her parents had been real, and not just shadows stolen by time. She kept them hidden like treasure, safe from sharp words and careless hands. Kaiser followed, his nails clicking softly against the floor. He settled near her bed, body curled like a wall of muscle and fur. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the meager light from the lamp. Sophie reached down, resting her fingers on the top of his head. "You won't let her take them away from me, will you?" she whispered. Kaiser gave no answer, but shifted closer, pressing his body against the side of her bed. The steady rise and fall of his breath filled the silence Miriam had left behind. Sophie curled up on the mattress, pulling the blanket to her chin. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her small body shivering with more than cold. She thought of her parents' laughter, of the way her father's hand felt when it swallowed hers whole, of her mother's voice humming softly as she brushed Sophie's hair. The house was empty of those sounds now, but in her mind, she clung to them with everything she had. Outside, the Montana wind rattled the shutters again, a lonely howl that threaded through the night. Sophie pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Kaiser's growl rumbled once more, low and steady, when Miriam's footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. The shepherd's ears stayed erect, his muscles coiled, ready if needed. Only when the house settled again, when Miriam's door slammed shut, did Sophie's breathing slow. Her fingers still rested lightly against Kaiser's fur. Beneath a roof that offered no warmth, Sophie found it in the only place left to her, the silent loyalty of the dog, who refused to leave her side. The bus from Billings hissed to a stop at Riverton's main street, just as the late afternoon sun slid low over the Montana hills. Daniel Cross stepped down onto the cracked pavement, duffel bag slung across one shoulder. He paused for a moment, boots planted firmly, as though measuring the distance between the man he had been overseas and the one this small town would expect to see. The air smelled of pine smoke drifting from chimneys, of snowmelt trickling down gutters, but beneath the familiar scents was a weight, a silence that clung to the streets, broken only by the hum of an old pickup rattling past. Daniel adjusted the strap of his bag, eyes scanning the storefronts. Some were new, some unchanged. The Bluebird Diner still had its neon sign flickering in uneven bursts, and the old church bell tower still cast its shadow across the valley. He had not been home in years. Deployment after deployment had kept him moving. Afghanistan, Syria, places where the air itself seemed hostile. Yet nothing had prepared him for the heaviness pressing into his chest as he set foot again in Riverton. At the sheriff's office, he stopped to ask questions. Sheriff Nolan Briggs wasn't in, but the deputy behind the desk recognized his name. Daniel watched the man hesitate, words catching before they came out. "You haven't heard?" the deputy asked carefully. Then, piece by piece, Daniel learned. A mafia ambush. His best friend, Officer James Hayes, and his wife Elena, gone in a spray of bullets 3 winters ago. They had left behind one child, Sophie. The deputy's voice softened when he said her name. "She's with her aunt now, out at the old Miller farmhouse. Not much of a place for a kid, if you ask me." Daniel thanked him and walked out, his jaw tight, his stride faster than before. Memories rose with each step. James laughing in their academy days, Eleanor setting a plate of food on the table when Daniel came by after shift, the baby girl in a bassinet by the fire, reaching her tiny fingers toward him. He had promised James once, half joking, half serious, "If anything ever happens, I'll be there for her." That promise had slept in the back of his mind, buried under sand and steel. Now it woke like a blade against his throat. The farmhouse stood at the far edge of Cottonwood Lane, leaning against the wind as though ready to fall. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving grey boards exposed. A single light glowed dimly behind the frosted kitchen window. Daniel slowed his steps, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. Through the glass, blurred by frost, he saw her. A thin figure, balanced on a stool at the sink, sleeves rolled past her elbows. Her head barely cleared the counter as she scrubbed at a dish, hands red from the water. Even at a distance, Daniel recognized her. The chestnut-brown hair, the small frame. Sophie Hayes. She should have been playing with dolls or chasing a ball in the yard. Instead, she worked like someone twice her age, her shoulders bent, her face set in a weariness no child should know. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached out and pressed his palm briefly against the cold siding of the house, steadying himself. He climbed the steps to the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, loud enough that the sound carried inside. He placed his bag down gently and reached for the door. Before his hand touched the knob, a growl split the silence. Low, guttural, dangerous. It vibrated through the wood as if the house itself was warning him. Daniel froze, pulse hammering. He had faced ambushes in desert alleys, but this sound rooted him in place in a way no enemy ever had. The growl rose again, sharper this time. Through the narrow crack between curtain and frame, Daniel caught the flash of amber eyes. Kaiser, the German shepherd. He remembered the dog, once a bundle of ears and oversized paws, trained alongside James during patrol shifts. Now he was full-grown, hardened, his muscles taut as he stood squarely in front of Sophie. The animal's stance was unmistakable. This was no house pet. This was a guardian ready to give his life. Inside, Sophie looked up, startled. The dish slipped from her hands, clattering into the basin. She spun toward the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion and something like hope. Daniel's breath caught. He lifted a hand slowly, pressing it against the doorframe, as if the gesture could carry reassurance through the wood. "It's me," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him yet. His voice trembled with the weight of years, with the guilt of not being there when she needed him most. Kaiser's growl deepened, vibrating against the boards. And Daniel didn't move. He understood the warning. He had seen it before on battlefields, in the eyes of men and in the eyes of dogs who had seen too much. So he stood still, waiting for the chance to prove he wasn't a threat, that he had come not to take, but to keep. The wind pressed against the house, rattling the shutters. Somewhere deep inside, Sophie's small voice rose, calling out in surprise. And Daniel, standing on the threshold of his friend's broken home, knew this was the moment that would change everything. The hinges groaned as Daniel eased the door open, cold air slipping past him into the dim kitchen. He stepped inside cautiously, every movement measured, like entering enemy ground where one wrong move could ignite an explosion. He hadn't made it 3 steps before Kaiser lunged forward. The German shepherd planted himself squarely between Sophie and the doorway, hackles bristling, lips pulled back to bare teeth. His growl was a sound meant to curdle blood, low, primal, vibrating through the floorboards. The muscles across his shoulders rippled as he crouched, ready to spring. Daniel froze. He'd seen trained K9s on deployment, had watched them tear through insurgent hideouts like forces of nature. He knew the sound of a dog who meant every note of his warning. Kaiser wasn't bluffing. Behind the shepherd, Sophie had gone still. Her hands clutched the edge of the basin, knuckles whitening, chest rising and falling too fast. The lamplight caught her face, and Daniel saw the conflict written there. Fear of the stranger in her doorway, and something softer, some tiny spark of familiarity that she didn't yet dare to trust. "Easy," Daniel said quietly, voice steady but pitched low, like he was soothing a skittish horse. He didn't move closer. His hands stayed open at his sides, palms outward. "I'm not here to hurt you." Kaiser's ears flattened. The growl rose again, his entire body braced like a drawn bow. Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving the dogs. "Kaiser," he murmured, testing the name. The shepherd's amber eyes narrowed, but the sound of his own name made his growl falter for half a breath. Daniel reached slowly into his jacket pocket, careful not to startle either of them. From it, he pulled a small silver tag, worn at the edges from sand and sweat. He held it up, letting it catch the thin kitchen light. "This," he said softly, "was your dad's." His voice cracked on the word dad. "James Hayes, my brother, in every way that mattered." Sophie's eyes widened. She whispered, almost inaudible, "Daddy's." Her small voice trembled, as if speaking the word itself was dangerous. Kaiser's growl thinned to a sharp whine, uncertain now. His gaze flicked between the tag and Daniel's face, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent clinging to the metal. Old leather, oil, sweat. A memory locked deep in his bones. Daniel crouched low, lowering himself until he was eye level with the shepherd. "I was there," he whispered. "Every patrol, every night. Your dad trusted me with his life." He extended the tag forward, resting it in his open palm. Kaiser's chest heaved. For a long, tense moment, the dog stayed rigid. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. His nose brushed against the tag, drawing in the scent. His ears twitched. He looked up at Daniel again, studying him like a soldier recognizing an ally after years apart. The growl broke into silence. Kaiser huffed once, tail twitching faintly against the floor. Not wagging, just one careful flick, the smallest sign of truce. Sophie gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling despite her efforts to blink them back. Daniel's chest ached. He stayed crouched, his eyes burning with emotion. "It's all right," he said gently, not sure if he was speaking to Sophie, or to the dog, or to himself. Kaiser stepped back, easing his body out of a tack stance. He turned his head slightly towards Sophie, as if giving her permission. She looked between them, her lips trembling. Daniel forced himself to breathe evenly. "Sophie," he said, his voice hushed and reverent. "It's me, Daniel Cross. I used to carry you on my shoulders when your mom was on shift. I promised your dad I'd watch over you if—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "If anything ever happened." The silence that followed felt endless. Sophie's chest hitched. She pressed a hand against Kaiser's back, the only anchor she trusted. Her wide eyes searched Daniel's face, hunting for truth in the lines of age, in the grey threaded through his hair, in the scar peeking from beneath his sleeve. Kaiser gave another small huff, then settled onto his haunches. The tail flicked again, this time more deliberate. For Sophie, that was enough. Her lips parted, her voice breaking like fragile glass. "Daddy?" The word wasn't for her real father. She knew he was gone, but it carried all the ache of absence, all the need that had built inside her over years of silence. It was a plea, a cry, a prayer. Daniel's vision blurred. He set the tag on the floor gently, and reached his arms open, palms still bare, inviting but not forcing. "It's me," he said, voice unsteady. "I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." Sophie hesitated only a heartbeat more before she stumbled forward, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She crossed the space between them and collapsed into his arms, her thin frame trembling violently. Daniel caught her, holding her close, feeling the sharp ridges of her spine, the way her ribs pressed through the thin sweater. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed, the sound tearing through the quiet house like a storm breaking. Kaiser circled once, then lay beside them, his body pressed against Sophie's legs. His amber eyes remained fixed on Daniel, not entirely unguarded, but watchful, as if to say, "I'll give you this chance. Don't fail her." Daniel bent his head, his cheek against Sophie's damp hair. His throat worked as he whispered words he'd been carrying since the desert, across oceans, across years. "I should have been here sooner, but I'm here now. I promise." Sophie's arms clung tighter around his neck, as though afraid he might disappear. Kaiser sighed heavily, lowering his head to the floor. The growl that had greeted Daniel was gone, replaced by the steady presence of a guardian who had decided, reluctantly but surely, that the man before him belonged. And in that dim, drafty kitchen, with the scent of smoke and cold water lingering in the air, a broken family took its first fragile step back toward being whole. For a long moment the kitchen held its breath. The old farmhouse creaked in the wind, but inside, the only sounds were Sophie's trembling breaths and the low hum of Kaiser's growl fading into silence. Daniel stayed crouched, his arms still open, waiting. He had learned patience on desert patrols, how to hold steady when a wrong move meant disaster. But this waiting felt different. This was no battlefield ambush. This was a child deciding whether to believe in hope again. Sophie's hazel-green eyes stayed fixed on him, wide and wet, darting over his face, as if searching for traces of someone she had once known. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. The silence stretched, unbearable and fragile, until at last her voice cracked through it. "Daddy?" The single word left her mouth like it had been buried for years, pulled from the deepest part of her chest. It was not the voice of certainty. It was the voice of a child, desperate for something to hold on to, terrified it might vanish if she spoke too loud. Daniel's throat closed. The words struck him harder than any blast or bullet ever had. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. His best friend was gone. But his daughter, the child he had sworn in silence to protect, was calling him by the name she needed most. Before he could answer, Sophie stumbled forward. The dam of hesitation broke, and she collapsed into his arms with a sob that shook her whole body. Daniel caught her against his chest, her small frame folding into him as though she had been waiting for this embrace all her life. She clung to him with a strength that startled him, her thin arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers digging into his jacket. The reality of her fragility stunned him. Beneath her sweater, he could feel every rib, each one pressing against him like sharp stones. Her spine was knobby under his hand, her shoulders so narrow it seemed a breeze might snap them. He had carried wounded soldiers out of fire zones with less caution than he held this child now, her tears soaked into his collar. He lowered his cheek against her tangled hair, breathing in the scent of soap and smoke that clung to her. His chest ached so fiercely, it felt as though it might split apart. He nearly broke there on the kitchen floor, but he forced himself to stay steady for her. "It's all right," he whispered, though his voice cracked under the weight of it. "You're safe. I've got you now." Sophie's cries came harder at those words, muffled against his shoulder. Years of loneliness and fear poured out in trembling sobs that shook her frail body. Daniel rocked her gently, one hand stroking her back, whispering fragments of comfort he wasn't sure she could even hear. "I'm here, I promise. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Kaiser, who had stood rigid moments before, gave a short huff. He paced once around them, paws clicking softly against the worn floorboards, as though circling to test the perimeter. Then, satisfied, he settled at Sophie's side, lowering his massive frame to the ground. His amber eyes flicked to Daniel with wary calculation. But there was something else now. A shift, a recognition. The shepherd's tail brushed the floor once, faint but unmistakable. An unspoken verdict. "I'll allow this. You belong." Daniel met the dog's eyes over Sophie's trembling shoulder. It felt like a soldier's handshake, a pact between guardians. He looked down at the child in his arms, her face hidden against him, and knew with gut certainty that she had carried scars no one had cared to see. He thought of her cracked hands at the sink, the way she had stiffened when the door opened, the hunger in her eyes. These were not the marks of a child cared for. These were the silent wounds of neglect, etched as deeply as any battlefield scar. His jaw clenched. Fury rose, hot and violent, but he pushed it down. This moment was not for rage. This moment was for her. Sophie's sobs began to ease into hiccuping breaths, her small chest pressing unevenly against his ribs. She lifted her head at last, eyes swollen and red, cheeks streaked with tears. For the first time, Daniel saw the little girl she had been before. Grief had hollowed her out. Her mother's eyes shining through. Her father's stubbornness in the way she clung to him still. "Are you really staying?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Daniel cupped the side of her face gently, his calloused hand dwarfing her fragile cheek. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. His voice was steady this time, carrying the same certainty with which he'd once given orders to men under fire. "Not again. Not ever." She searched his eyes, as if testing the truth of his words. Whatever she found there seemed to be enough. She leaned into his palm, her lashes fluttering shut for a moment, and let out a shaky sigh. Kaiser shifted closer, pressing his body against her legs. Sophie reached blindly, her hand finding the thick fur of his neck. She held him while she leaned against Daniel, as if afraid to let go of either. The three of them stayed that way, in silence, bound together by grief, loyalty, and the fragile beginnings of trust. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but it could not penetrate the circle drawn on the kitchen floor. A soldier, a child, and a dog, all scarred by loss, all clinging to the chance that maybe, just maybe, family could be remade. The house had grown so quiet that even the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall sounded too loud. Sophie still clung to Daniel, her small fingers knotted into the fabric of his jacket. Kaiser pressed against her legs like a living shield, his amber eyes unblinking as he kept watch over both of them. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, measured, deliberate. The boards creaked beneath the weight, the sound crisp against the Montana wind. Kaiser's head snapped up, a low rumble starting deep in his chest. His ears flicked forward, tail stiff as a rod. Sophie stiffened, clutching Daniel tighter. Daniel lifted his head toward the door, instincts quick to flare. He shifted Sophie slightly behind him, his muscles coiled. A soldier never lost the habit of preparing for intrusion, even in a broken farmhouse. But the knock that followed was not sharp or demanding. It was gentle, 3 soft raps against the frame, as though the one outside respected the silence within. A thin voice carried through the door. "Emily, Kaiser. Then, after a pause, "Is everything all right in there?" Daniel rose slowly, careful not to jostle Sophie, and moved toward the door. He opened it halfway, and the light from inside spilled across the figure standing on the porch, Martha Quinn. She was tall and slender, despite the years bending her spine. Her back stooped slightly, but her bearing still sharp. Her white hair was wound into a tidy bun, and her spectacles caught the glow of the kitchen lamp. Even in the dimness, her eyes shone like pale slate, steady and knowing. She clutched a wool cardigan close around her narrow frame, the fabric rippling in the wind. "Martha," Daniel said softly, recognizing her. She had lived across the lane for as long as he could remember. When he was a boy running errands for James Hayes, she was already the teacher who ran her classroom with a firm hand and a soft heart. Her eyes widened when they fell on him. She took a half step forward, her breath catching. "Daniel Cross. Lord above. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me." Daniel gave a faint nod, voice tight. "Evening, ma'am." Kaiser's growl lowered but didn't fade completely. He stood between them, suspicious as always, though not hostile. Martha gave the shepherd a small, steady glance, her lips pressing thin. "I heard the commotion," she said, her voice calm but edged with concern. "That bark of his could wake the dead. I thought Sophie might be in trouble." At the mention of her name, Sophie peeked out from behind Daniel, her cheeks streaked with tears, her eyes still red. Martha's stern features softened instantly. "Oh, child," she whispered. "Come here, sweetheart." But Sophie didn't move. She clutched Daniel's sleeve instead, her small body trembling against his side. Martha's gaze shifted back to him, narrowing slightly. "She doesn't trust easily anymore," she said quietly, as if the words were not accusation but lament. "Not after these years." Daniel swallowed hard. His chest felt heavier than when he'd carried 50 pounds of gear across foreign sand. He looked down at Sophie, her fragile body pressed against him, and shame knifed through him. "Where were you when she needed you?" The question burned in his mind. He had been oceans away, fighting battles that felt endless, while this child had fought her own war inside a house too cold to be called a home. Martha stepped closer, her voice dropping. "She's been coming to my porch at night. Not often, but enough for me to know. Always polite, too polite. Barely a knock, just her standing there with that dog at her side." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I'd leave a bit of bread, sometimes a jar of milk," Martha continued. She never said much, just took it and hurried home. The dog never touched the food until she gave it to him. Loyal creature. Her eyes flicked to Kaiser with reluctant respect. But no child should live like that. Daniel's vision blurred for a moment, his breath sharp in his throat. He bent his head slightly, unable to meet Martha's eyes. Guilt pressed heavy in his gut, but beneath it, something harder took root. Resolve. "I wasn't here," he admitted, his voice low, rough. "I should have been. James trusted me, and I left her to this." Martha's hand, thin and lined with age, lifted and touched his forearm briefly. "You were at war, Daniel. Don't mistake absence for abandonment. But now that you're here, don't you dare turn your back again. That child has held on long enough without the love she deserves." Daniel looked at Sophie, still half hidden against him, and nodded slowly. His throat tightened, but his words came steady. "Never again." Behind them, Kaiser shifted, his tail brushing softly against Sophie's leg. The shepherd lowered his head to the floor, no longer growling, as though he too had heard and judged the vow. Martha's gaze lingered on Daniel, measuring him like she once measured the worth of her students. Finally, she gave a short nod. Good, because she'll need more than promises. She'll need proof, every day. Daniel absorbed the words like a command, the kind he had once taken without question in the field. He straightened, the soldier in him alive again, not for combat, but for fatherhood. The farmhouse seemed to settle then, the creaks fading, the air growing still. Sophie leaned her face into Daniel's sleeve, her hand buried in Kaiser's fur. For the first time in years, the night did not feel entirely hopeless. Outside, the church bell in town began to toll the hour. Its solemn sound drifted across the valley, carried on the wind. Daniel listened, his arm around Sophie, Martha's words still ringing in his ears. He had not been there when James and Eleanor were taken, but he was here now, and he would not abandon their daughter again, not while he still drew breath. The farmhouse had settled into an uneasy calm. The lamp on the kitchen table flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Sophie sat pressed against Daniel's side, her face still blotched from tears, one hand buried in Kaiser's fur. The German shepherd lay curled at her feet, his ears alert, his amber eyes fixed on the doorway as if he knew peace never lasted long in this house. The quiet broke with the slam of the front door. The sound rattled the window panes and sent Sophie's shoulders jerking upward. "Girl!" The voice was sharp, raspy with smoke. "Where are you hiding now?" A moment later, Aunt Miriam swept into the room. Her auburn hair was pinned back carelessly, grey streaks catching the lamplight. A cigarette smoldered between her fingers, trailing a ribbon of ash. She exhaled a cloud of smoke into the air as if she owned it, her eyes already narrowed in suspicion. Then she saw Daniel. Her steps faltered, and her lips curled into a mocking smile. "Well, I'll be damned. Look who crawled back." She flicked her cigarette into the sink, ash scattering across the counter. The Marine himself. You do have a knack for showing up when it's convenient, don't you? Sophie's breath hitched. She shrank against Daniel, clutching his sleeve. Kaiser rose slowly to his feet, the hair along his spine lifting. A low growl rumbled from his chest, deep and steady, a warning carved out of instinct and loyalty. Daniel stayed seated, his gaze steady, his posture calm. But there was steel in the set of his jaw. "Miriam," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command honed in deserts and mountains. She crossed her arms, her sharp eyes darting from Sophie to him, then back again. "So what's this then? You think you can waltz in after years away and play hero? She's my responsibility, my roof, my rules." She pointed the cigarette at Sophie, who flinched as though the gesture itself burned. And she knows it. Sophie's small body trembled against Daniel. Her fingers tightened, desperate for him not to let go. Daniel rose at last, moving with deliberate calm. He stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the narrow kitchen. His presence changed the air itself, as though the house had forgotten what it was like to hold the weight of a man unwilling to bend. "You've had your say," Daniel told her. His voice was even, but beneath it simmered something cold and immovable. He looked down at Sophie, then back at Miriam. Things change now. Miriam's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Change? You don't get to stroll in here after 3 years and decide how things run. You weren't here when the bills came due. You weren't here when she cried in the night. I was." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "You were here, but you weren't raising her. You were breaking her." His eyes flicked toward Sophie's hands, the skin raw and cracked. "I've seen what you've done. She's 8 years old, Miriam. Not a servant. Not a bargaining chip. Miriam's eyes flashed, her thin lips twisting. You don't know what it's taken to keep this place standing, to keep that mutt fed. You think you can judge me? Kaiser's growl deepened at the word mutt. His stance widened, teeth flashing in the lamplight. Sophie pressed closer to him, whispering his name, but her aunt's voice only rose. You don't belong here anymore, Daniel Cross. You left. You stayed gone. And now you're going to march in and pretend you're the savior. You're no better than your dead friend, thinking the world owes you something. Daniel's fists tightened at his sides, but he didn't rise to the bait. His voice came low and steady, like an oath. I promised James I'd look after his family, if anything happened. I failed him once. I won't fail again. The words cut through the smoke like a blade. For the first time, Miriam faltered. Her bravado thinned, her eyes flickering between the unflinching soldier and the dog bristling at her every move. The silence that followed was broken only by Sophie's small, shaky whisper. Please, Aunt Miriam, don't. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. You will not raise your hand or your voice to her again. Not while I'm here. Kaiser moved with him, shoulder to shoulder, his growl now a steady rumble of warning. His eyes locked on Miriam, daring her to take one step closer. For a heartbeat, the kitchen became a battlefield. Smoke curled between them, the air taut with unspoken threats. Miriam's glare wavered, but she didn't answer. She turned on her heel, muttering curses as she stomped down the hallway, the slam of her door shaking the frame. The farmhouse sank back into silence. Sophie sagged against Daniel, her breath uneven, her small fingers gripping Kaiser's fur as if her life depended on it. Daniel crouched to her level, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It's all right, he whispered. She doesn't get to decide anymore. Not about you. Kaiser settled at Sophie's feet again, his body pressed against hers, a wall of muscle and loyalty. His eyes stayed on the dark hallway, ears twitching at every sound, but his presence was steady, unyielding. Sophie buried her face in Daniel's chest, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the rules in this house could truly change. The farmhouse seemed to exhale after Miriam's door slammed shut, but the air did not lighten. Smoke still clung to the rafters, and silence hung so heavily it pressed against Sophie's small shoulders. She sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, head bowed, as if she feared even breathing too loudly might bring her aunt storming back. Daniel pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down slowly, his posture careful, like a man defusing a bomb. Kaiser padded over, lowering his weight onto the floor beside Sophie's chair, his body curved protectively against her legs. The soft thump of his tail against the floor was the only sound breaking the hush. Daniel studied the girl. She wouldn't meet his eyes, staring instead at her own hands, raw and red, against the faded fabric of her sweater. Her knuckles were split, the skin swollen and cracked from cold water, and work far too heavy for a child. He had seen wounds like that on soldiers, men who had labored until the skin gave out. Seeing them on his best friend's daughter made his throat tighten until it hurt to swallow. Sophie, he said gently, his voice softer than he thought himself capable of. Look at me. Her lashes fluttered, but she didn't lift her gaze. Instead, her lip trembled, and the silence stretched. Finally she whispered, barely audible, "If I don't finish the chores." She stopped, her throat working as if the words themselves cut her. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Go on," he urged, his tone patient but firm. Her voice cracked when she forced the rest out. "If I don't finish the chores, Kaiser doesn't get food." The words hung in the air like a confession, fragile and terrible. She pressed her hands tighter together, her small shoulders curling inward as though ashamed. Tears pooled in her eyes, but didn't fall. She had learned too well to keep them hidden. Daniel's vision blurred for a moment. He reached across the table and gently unfolded her hands, laying them palm up so he could see the damage. Each fingertip was chapped raw, tiny cuts running across the ridges. The skin looked burned from hours in icy water. Rage surged inside him, swift and volcanic. He wanted to storm down the hallway, rip open Miriam's door, and drag her into the night to answer for every scar, every tear. His fists clenched involuntarily, the cords in his forearms tightening. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his breath came short, sharp, dangerous. But then Sophie flinched at the movement of his hand, mistaking his anger for something aimed at her. That broke him. He unclenched his fists at once and reached out, cupping her small hands with a tenderness that felt foreign to his own calloused skin. His voice, when it came, was steady again, though it shook deep down in places he didn't let her see. "None of that is your fault. You hear me? Not one bit." Her chin trembled. She tried to pull her hands back, but he held them gently, his thumb brushing over the split skin. "She makes me do it," Sophie whispered. "She says if the dishes aren't clean, if the floors aren't scrubbed, if I don't keep up, then Kaiser goes hungry. And if I try to stop—" Her voice failed, breaking into silence. Kaiser, as if understanding, nudged his head against her knee, his warm weight grounding her. She dropped a hand to his fur, burying her fingers in his coat, as though holding on for life itself. Daniel's jaw worked, but his words stayed even. "Sophie, no one is ever taking food from him again. Not while I'm here. Do you understand?" Her gaze lifted at last, her hazel green eyes wide and wet. She searched his face as if looking for cracks, as if expecting him to falter the way so many others had. But Daniel didn't look away. He held her gaze with the full weight of a Marine who had once sworn to hold the line, no matter the firestorm. Slowly, Sophie nodded. Daniel squeezed her hands once more, then released them gently. He stood, drawing in a breath that steadied the fury boiling inside him. He glanced down the hallway where Miriam had vanished, his jaw hardening. "This ends now," he murmured. Kaiser rose to his feet, ears pricked, body angled toward the hallway, as though echoing the vow. His tail flicked once, not in joy, but in readiness, as though he too had decided this house would no longer belong to cruelty. Daniel placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, the weight of it steady, grounding. "You're safe with me," he said, low and certain. "I promise you that." "And promises, Sophie, mine don't break." The girl pressed her face into Kaiser's fur, her small shoulders shaking silently. Daniel let her cry, standing guard as the house creaked and groaned around them. The soldier in him had found a new battlefield, and its name was justice. The house surrendered tonight slowly, the wind rattling the shutters in restless bursts before falling still again. The old farmhouse always seemed to breathe differently once Miriam shut herself away in her room, her door slamming like a prison gate. After that, silence spread through the halls, heavy and uneasy, broken only by the groan of timber beams and the faint hiss of winter air sneaking through the cracks. Sophie's small room sat at the far end of the hallway, its wallpaper peeling, its window patched with an old sheet of plastic that fluttered faintly with each draft. The mattress sagged in the middle, barely covered by a threadbare quilt. Yet tonight, despite the chill, she found warmth, the only way she ever truly did, by curling into Kaiser. The German shepherd stretched across the narrow bed, his sable coat spread like a shield. Sophie pressed herself against him, her small hand gripping a tuft of fur at his shoulder, as though afraid he might vanish in the night. Her breath came in soft, uneven sighs, hitching now and then as she drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. Daniel stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching them. The glow from the hallway lamp cast long shadows across the floorboards, catching the angles of his face in flickers of light and dark. His chest felt like it carried a weight no rifle or pack had ever given him. He had shouldered gear through mountains and deserts, had marched until his boots wore holes, but nothing pressed against him like the sight of James's little girl clinging to a dog for comfort instead of family. His gaze lingered on her hands, visible where the quilt had slipped. Even in sleep, the raw skin was obvious, the split knuckles red from weeks of cold water and harsh work. He thought of what she had whispered at the table, that Kaiser's meals depended on her chores, that her aunt's cruelty had turned survival into a bargain no child should ever know. The memory made his jaw tighten until it hurt. Kaiser stirred, his amber eyes sliding open just enough to catch Daniel in the doorway. For a heartbeat, man and dog stared at each other. The shepherd didn't growl, didn't shift. He only gave a quiet huff, then lowered his head back onto the mattress, his body still pressed tight against Sophie's. It was trust, offered cautiously, but clearly. Daniel stepped quietly into the room. The floor creaked under his boots, but Sophie didn't wake. He crouched beside the bed, lowering himself until he was eye level with her small face. In the dim light, she looked younger, her lashes resting on her cheeks, her lips parted in fragile surrender to sleep. He reached out, careful not to wake her, and brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her forehead. His hand lingered in the air above her, trembling faintly before he drew it back. His whisper came low, meant only for himself, and maybe the dog who never stopped listening. "I'll fix this. By the book." The words were not just a vow. They were an anchor. He had spent years living by orders, missions, chains of command, protocols etched into his bones. Now there were no orders, no commanding officer to guide his hand. But there was Sophie, and she needed him more than any squad ever had. This would be his mission, his war. Not with rifles or sandbags, but with justice. He thought of Sheriff Briggs, of the law still steady in this town, of Martha Quinn's words on the porch, "Don't you dare turn your back again." He thought of James, the best friend who had bled beside him, who had trusted him with laughter and loyalty, and a promise Daniel had failed to keep, until now. His chest swelled with something fierce, something that burned like resolve. This time, he would not falter. He sat back on his heels, resting his elbows on his knees, his head bowed for a moment in silence. A Marine's vow was never given lightly, and tonight he gave one not to a nation or a uniform, but to a child asleep in a broken house. He rose quietly, pulling the quilt higher over Sophie's shoulders. She murmured faintly, her hand tightening on Kaiser's fur, but she didn't wake. Kaiser's ears flicked, his eyes opening again, catching Daniel's movement. The dog's gaze softened. Not warm, not yet, but no longer hard. A recognition passed between them. Two guardians, different in form, bound by the same duty. Daniel stepped back toward the doorway, pausing for one last look. The room was still drafty, the house still cracked and tired, but what lay on that bed was the reason he had come back. Sophie and Kaiser, broken, bruised, but unbroken where it mattered. He closed the door part way, leaving it ajar so light from the hallway could soften the dark. As he walked down the hall, the floor creaked under his boots, like a heartbeat. His mind turned over the battles ahead, Miriam's cruelty, the secrets she was hiding, the neglect Sophie had suffered in silence. But tonight, for the first time, Daniel did not feel lost in the storm. He had a mission, and he had already sworn the words that would carry him through it. "I'll fix this. By the book." The farmhouse exhaled again, but this time, Daniel didn't hear defeat in its sigh. He heard challenge. The morning light in Riverton came slow and heavy, pressing through a sky the color of lead. Frost clung to storefront windows, and the flag outside the sheriff's office snapped hard in the wind. Daniel paused at the bottom of the stone steps. He had walked into command posts across the world, but this step into a small-town office felt heavier than all of them combined. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and stale coffee. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he followed the young deputy's nod toward the back office. Everyone in Riverton knew Sheriff Nolan Briggs didn't need introductions. "Come in," came the gravelly voice from within. Behind a scarred oak desk sat Briggs, stocky, silver-haired, 55, with the quiet strength of a rancher and the eyes of a man shaped by grief and grit. When he saw Daniel, he rose, his handshake lingering with recognition. "Daniel Cross, back in Riverton at last." "It's been a while," Daniel said. Briggs studied him carefully. "Too long, but I reckon you didn't come here to catch up." Daniel drew a slow breath. "It's about Sophie." The sheriff's face darkened. He gestured for Daniel to sit. The words came clipped and sharp. Daniel told him everything: Sophie's cracked hands, Miriam's bargain over chores and food, and the whisper at the table, "If I don't finish chores, Kaiser doesn't eat." Briggs listened in silence. When Daniel repeated Sophie's words exactly, his jaw clenched. He leaned back, exhaling. "Lord Almighty." "She's 8 years old," Daniel said, fury tight in his voice. "And Miriam treats her like a tool, like leverage." "You're right," Briggs said quietly. "But if we move too fast, she'll wriggle free. We need evidence, testimony, accounts that a judge can't ignore." Daniel steadied himself. "So, where do we start?" "With proof," Briggs said. "Martha Quinn's word will help, but we'll need more. Receipts, bank records, photographs of Sophie's hands. You keep her close. Keep that dog closer." "I'll pull what I can from the county records." Daniel thought Sophie curled against Kaiser the night before, whispering to Daddy like it was her last chance to believe in someone. His chest ached, but beneath the ache burned resolve. "She's held on this long," he said, "but I won't let her carry it another day alone." Briggs's voice softened. "I lost my daughter years ago. I'd give anything to have the chance you've got now. Don't waste it." Daniel swallowed hard. "I won't." The silence between them settled steady, like an oath. At last, Briggs stood, gazing out the frosted window. "This county's seen its share of dark men and women. But when it comes to children, Daniel, I don't bend. Then we fight this together. Together. By the book." Their handshake sealed it. A new mission had begun, not with rifles, but with paper, law, and the unyielding will of two men who knew the cost of silence. The sky had turned the color of steel by the time Daniel and Sophie returned to the farmhouse. Kaiser padded between them, more soldier than pet, his steps steady and deliberate. Sheriff Briggs's words echoed in Daniel's mind. Proof, testimony, records. Without evidence, Miriam's cruelty would remain only whispers. With it, she would have nowhere to run. But when they pulled into the yard, Miriam's old truck was parked crooked in the dirt. Rust and stale smoke clung to it like rot. Kaiser froze halfway up the path, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. He veered to the truck, circling, sniffing, claws scraping dirt. Then came one sharp bark, not alarmed, but certain. Daniel crouched. His fingers found something wedged near the rear axle, a torn envelope, damp with mud and grease. Inside were pawn tickets stamped in red, extravagant restaurant receipts, and one crumpled transfer slip. The name on the line struck him like a punch. Rick Dalton, Miriam's cousin. A smirking, slick-tongued conman Riverton had long stopped trusting. If Miriam was funneling Sophie's support money to him, it was more than neglect. It was a fraud. Sophie leaned close, her breath fogging in the cold. She didn't understand the slips of paper, but she felt the weight in Daniel's hands. Kaiser sat back, chest broad, amber eyes certain. He had found the truth. Daniel stared at him with awe. "Good boy. You're better than half the detectives I've known." Sophie knelt, whispering into Kaiser's ear. "Thank you for keeping us safe." The shepherd pressed his nose against her palm, eyes closing for a moment in wordless bond. Daniel straightened, the envelope tight in his grip. This wasn't just rage anymore. It was ammunition. "We're done playing by her rules," he said quietly. "From now on, we will fight by ourselves." The bell above the Bluebird Diner jingled as Daniel ushered Sophie and Kaiser inside. Warmth hit them. Bacon, biscuits, coffee, laughter. After the cold, it felt like another world. Sophie's eyes widened. She hadn't spoken on the drive, clinging to Kaiser's collar, but the sight of food softened her shoulders. Martha Quinn sat near the window, cardigan pulled tight. She raised a hand as they approached. Sophie slid into the booth, Kaiser curling beneath the table as her anchor. Daniel ordered without hesitation. Eggs, sausage, biscuits, milk for Sophie. Coffee for himself. When the plate arrived, Sophie's hands trembled. She stared at the food like it was something rare. Her first bite undid her. Tears pricked her eyes as she ate quickly, desperately, as if it might be taken away. Daniel's chest twisted. He forced himself to watch, to remember the anger it stirred. Martha's voice was low. "Briggs stopped by. Said you brought him the first pieces." Daniel tapped the envelope hidden in his jacket. Receipts, pawn slips, transfers. Enough to tie Miriam and Rick Dalton together. Martha's mouth tightened. "That man's been in trouble since he could walk." Daniel leaned in. "We need testimony. Witnesses. Briggs wants it nailed so tight, Miriam can't wriggle free." "You'll have mine," Martha said firmly. "Every loaf of bread I left, every jar of milk. I'll swear it before any judge." Daniel's voice dropped. "We keep quiet. No warnings. If Miriam suspects, she'll scatter. Quiet as graves until the time comes." Martha agreed. Daniel looked at Sophie again. Color had returned to her cheeks. She smiled faintly, a crumb of biscuit at her mouth, Kaiser's head in her lap. For the first time since he'd returned, she looked like a child, not a servant, not leveraged, but a little girl at breakfast. The sight nearly broke him. This wasn't just legal work. It was a war. War for Sophie's soul, her laughter, her right to grow up without fear. Martha studied him. "You've got a fight in you, Daniel. But remember, fight with law, not fists. The law will hold longer. By the book, he murmured. Her eyes softened. Then maybe this town will see justice. Sophie finished the last bite, cheeks flushed. She bent close to Kaiser and whispered, "See? We're going to be all right." Kaiser's tail thumped once against the floor. Daniel exhaled, eyes closing for a moment. Whatever battles lay ahead, the mission was clear. Sophie's soul wasn't going to be lost, not on his watch. The night had teeth. A cold wind swept across the plains, carrying sage and dust to Riverton's southern edge, where the neon sign of El Coyote flickered orange and blue. The gravel lot brimmed with dented pickups, laughter spilling through the thin walls. Daniel parked 2 blocks away and walked in on foot, collar high, stride steady. A Marine knew how to blend with shadows. Tonight, Riverton's roughest bar was another battlefield. Behind him, Sophie was safe in the Bluebird diner with Martha, Kaiser curled at her feet like armor. Daniel hated leaving them, but this mission demanded silence. At the side entrance, he paused. The air reeked of smoke and spilled beer. His pulse slowed into rhythm. Patience, silence, precision. Inside, smoke hung low. Country music rattled from the jukebox. Darts thudded into wood, and tired barmaids threaded between tables. Daniel slid into a back booth, eyes fixed on Miriam's usual table. Tonight, she would come. With Rick Dalton. His fingers brushed the recorder Sheriff Briggs had lent him, no bigger than a matchbox. One click could capture every word, enough to bury Miriam legally. When the moment came, he moved like any patron stretching his legs. At Miriam's booth, he crouched, feigning a loose shoelace, and slipped the recorder beneath the table's seam. A faint click confirmed it was live. Then he waited. Marines knew how to sit still, how to let minutes stretch into hours. His weapon tonight was patience. At last, the door opened. Miriam swept in, her coat cinched tight, hair pinned high, lips painted harsh red. She carried herself like a queen among drunks. Rick Dalton followed, rail thin in a cheap leather jacket, grin sharp but hollow. They slid into the booth, voices low, blind to the trap humming inches from their hands. Daniel sat steady in the haze, a glass of water untouched before him. This battlefield had no rifles, but the enemy sat across the room, plotting. And tonight, truth was his weapon. The jukebox whined through another song, smoke curling toward the rafters. Daniel watched from the shadows as Miriam leaned close to Rick, her laugh sharp over the noise. The recorder caught it all. "Sell the land fast," Rick muttered. "The girl's nothing but trouble. She's a burden." Daniel's hand tightened on his glass. Sophie, 8 years old, dismissed like baggage. Miriam's voice sliced through. "Feeding her, clothing her. It's wasted effort. I should have sent her to the state when Caroline died. And now it's my turn to cash out." Daniel's jaw locked. He wanted to storm across the room, shout Sophie's name until Miriam choked on it. But evidence needed silence. Rick leaned closer. "You've got the papers ready?" "Tuesday," Miriam smirked. "Once it's signed, the land goes, and by then I'll be gone." Daniel forced his breath steady. Tuesday meant time. A window. Enough to tighten the noose legally. Miriam drained her glass and slammed it down. "And the girl? Let her rot. She's had her use." Daniel closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw Sophie's cracked hands, her whispered confession about chores and Kaiser. He saw her curled into the shepherd at night, clinging to him like the last warmth left in the world. And now, her own blood dismissed her as nothing. The recorder hummed on, catching every word. Rick chuckled. "You've got ice in your veins." "Survival," Miriam replied smugly. "That's all it ever is." Their laughter tangled with smoke and whiskey. They had no idea their downfall ticked beneath the table, blinking steady, steady, steady. Daniel leaned back into shadow, fury banked but alive. For Sophie's sake, he would wait. Tonight, the first shot had been fired, not with fists, but with silence. The sheriff's office smelled of stale coffee and cold paper when Daniel laid the recorder on Briggs's desk. Sophie sat in the corner, Kaiser pressed against her legs. "You got it?" Briggs asked, voice low. Daniel nodded. Every word. The sheriff pressed play. The small office filled with El Coyote's chaos, clinking glasses, jukebox twang, bursts of laughter. Then came Rick's sneer. "The girl's nothing but trouble. She's a burden." Sophie flinched, clutching Kaiser's fur until her knuckles whitened. Her aunt's laugh spilled next, venomous. "Feeding her, clothing her. It's wasted effort. I should have sent her to the state." Briggs's face darkened. His fists curled tight. The recorder rolled on. "Rick, you've got the papers ready, right?" Miriam. "Tuesday. Once it's signed, I'll be out of this town for good." The sheriff slammed his fist onto the desk. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "This is enough. Enough to bury her in court." Sophie whimpered, burying her face in Kaiser's neck. The shepherd didn't flinch. He pressed closer, amber eyes calm, his chest rising steady like a fortress around her. Daniel crouched beside her, hand on her back. "It's all right, sweetheart. They won't hurt you anymore." Briggs sat heavy in his chair, rubbing his face. "Tomorrow I'll file motions. Warrants, custody, financial records. We'll put her in cuffs, if it's the last thing I do." Daniel's voice was firm. "Airtight. No loopholes." "Airtight," Briggs agreed. "We'll move quiet. By the time Miriam knows, it'll be over." Sophie lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes pleading. "Does that mean we can go home?" Daniel brushed her cheek gently. "Yes, Sophie. A home no one can take from you again." Briggs' voice softened, rare and rough. "You're safe now, little one. I lost my girl years ago, but I won't lose you, not while I wear this badge." The recorder clicked off, its light dimming, but its words lingered. Proof of betrayal, cruelty dragged into the open. Daniel straightened, recognizing the shift. This was no longer just survival. This was justice. A war not with bullets, but with truth. And tonight, the first battle was won. The old red-brick church stood at Riverton's center like a sentinel, its steeple cutting the winter sky. Tonight, it was not filled with hymns, but with reckoning. Pastor Samuel Bennett had sent word. The truth about Sophie would be spoken in the open. Neighbors filed in at dusk, boots echoing on frozen stone, scarves pulled tight. The sanctuary smelled of pine polish and candle wax. Wooden pews groaned as townsfolk settled shoulder to shoulder, their whispers clinging to the rafters. Everyone knew fragments of Sophie's tragedy. Tonight, they wanted the whole. Daniel entered quietly near the back, Sophie's hand clenched around his sleeve. She pressed against him, wary of the staring faces. Kaiser walked tight at her side, his amber eyes sweeping the room like a sentry. Martha Quinn followed, cardigan buttoned, her presence carrying the weight of experience and moral authority. At the pulpit, Pastor Bennett raised a hand, his voice calm yet firm. "We gather not for worship, but for truth. The welfare of a child demands it. The soul of this community requires it. A hush fell until Miriam swept in. Her coat cinched, lips painted harsh red, she carried herself like a queen in exile. Rick Dalton trailed behind, grin sharp, eyes darting. They sat near the front, brittle confidence in every movement. Sophie's grip on Daniel's sleeve tightened painfully. He bent low. "Look at me, not them." She nodded, leaning into Kaiser. The shepherd pressed against her leg, a living wall. The pastor's words hung heavy. "Tonight, truth will be heard. Shadows will not hide it." Riverton leaned forward, breath held. Miriam stood first, voice trembling with feigned sorrow. "I sacrificed everything for her." She pressed her hands to her chest, eyes glittering with false tears. For a moment, some neighbors nodded, their instinct to trust a familiar face surfacing, but Daniel knew better. He had seen Sophie's cracked hands, her thin sweater against winter winds, the dog's ribs showing. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Sacrifice. Tell me, does a sacrifice leave a child hungry? Does it starve her dog until she must choose between chores and his food?" The murmurs shifted, sympathy cooling. Miriam's painted smile faltered. Then Sheriff Briggs stepped to the pulpit, a small stack of papers in hand. "The truth is in these." He spread receipts, pawn slips, and transfers to Rick Dalton, proof Sophie's support money had been stolen. Whispers rippled, sharper now, eyes narrowing at Miriam. Daniel lifted a small recorder, pressing play. The sanctuary filled with the smoky chaos of El Coyote, clinking glasses, country music, and then Miriam's own voice, slurred and venomous. "Sell the land fast. The girl's a burden. That dog, worthless if she doesn't finish her chores." Rick's laugh followed, sealing her guilt. Gasps echoed through the pews. Some neighbors covered their mouths, others leaned forward, faces hardening. Years of suspicion crystallized into certainty. Miriam's hands shook. That was, she stammered. But no excuse could erase the sound of her own words. Rick's grin cracked, his eyes wide with sudden fear. Kaiser growled low, a steady rumble that vibrated through the pews. Sophie pressed into him, eyes wide, clinging to Daniel's sleeve as if afraid the lies might still win. Pastor Bennett's voice cut through, calm but resolute. "The Lord sees all. Tonight, deception is stripped away. Justice stands before us." Miriam's gaze darted desperately around the sanctuary, but where she once found sympathy, she now met cold distrust. The mask she had worn for years was gone. The church doors opened with a creak, letting in the sting of Montana night. Deputies stepped inside, boots echoing. Their presence silenced the congregation. Sheriff Briggs faced the front. "Miriam Rowan, Richard Dalton, you are under arrest for child endangerment, neglect, and conspiracy to exploit a minor." His voice rang against the rafters like judgment itself. Miriam froze, panic breaking across her face. "You don't understand. She needs me," she sputtered. Rick snarled, "You can't do this. The land—" Briggs cut them off. "The law doesn't bend for excuses. Your time of manipulation ends here." Cuffs clicked, sharp as a gavel. Neighbors who once turned blind eyes now watched in stunned silence, then with relief. The lie that had ruled Sophie's life was over. In the back, Sophie clung to Kaiser, trembling. The shepherd pressed closer, lowering his head over her shoulder, a quiet promise in his amber eyes. "I've got you. I always will." Daniel knelt beside her, hand firm on her shoulder. "From now on, no one touches you," he whispered, voice steady as stone. Slowly, the tension in her small frame began to ease. As Miriam and Rick were led down the aisle, Sophie pressed her face into Kaiser's fur, tears wetting his coat. She inhaled the scent of loyalty and safety, letting herself believe it at last. Daniel took her hands. "Look at me, Sophie. They can't touch you now. You're safe. Always." Her lips trembled. I can finally breathe." Fragile words, but they broke the storm inside her. Daniel's chest tightened with both sorrow and relief. Neighbors murmured now not with doubt but resolve, speaking of how they would help, how they would protect. A community once complicit in silence was waking to its duty. Sheriff Briggs laid a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You did the right thing. Justice isn't just in law. It's in the hearts of those who protect the vulnerable." Daniel met Sophie's tearful eyes, her whisper carrying like a fragile prayer. "Daddy, thank you." He swallowed hard, nodding once. Kaiser's tail thumped faintly, as though sealing the vow. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, warmth settled. The warmth of truth, justice, and the fragile beginning of healing. As the deputies led Miriam and Rick away, the sound of cuffs echoed like the toll of the church bell, marking not just an ending, but a new beginning. Daniel rose, placing a steady hand on Kaiser's flank. "Let's go home," he said softly. Sophie clung to them both, the first stars piercing the night above like promises of light after long darkness. Morning mist curled low over Willow River, soft as a veil. Daniel stood on the riverbank, inhaling pine and damp earth, while behind him the cabin glowed in early sunlight. A modest timber home with wide windows, promising refuge without pretense. The Rowan house, with its shadows and cruelty, was gone. Sophie raced through the grass, laughter ringing like bells. Kaiser bounded after her with a branch bigger than his head, shaking water droplets into the sun until they fractured like prisms. Sophie's giggles mingled with the river's murmur, and Daniel's chest tightened with gratitude. Months of fear had weighed her down, but now she moved freely, spirit unbound. The cabin itself was simple, yet alive with possibility. A porch wide enough for evenings, windows framing the river, a stone fireplace promising warmth. Inside, sunlight painted shifting patterns on pine floors. And Sophie had already claimed a corner with colored pencils and sketchbooks. "Daniel, look!" she called, holding up a drawing. 3 figures beneath a roof. A man, a little girl, a dog. The lines were shaky but filled with clarity. Daniel knelt, brushing hair from her face. 3 under one roof, he murmured. The drawing captured not just their shapes, but their bond. "That's us," Sophie whispered proudly. "You, me, and Kaiser. Forever." Kaiser nudged her hand, tail thumping hard enough to rattle the floor. Sophie laughed, bending to scratch his ears, and Daniel's eyes misted. To see her safe and unafraid was more profound than any medal he had ever earned. They spent the morning exploring. Sophie darted between porch and riverbank. Daniel carried supplies, and Kaiser patrolled contentedly, a sentinel who knew his family was safe. Later, wrapped in a blanket on the porch, Sophie asked, "Can we plant flowers here? Maybe fruit trees?" Daniel squeezed her hand. "We can plant anything you want. This place is ours now." She leaned into him, whispering, "I'm glad." For the first time, relief and possibility belonged to them. By evening, the cabin glowed with firelight. Sophie perched on a chair while Daniel fumbled with her hair, fingers clumsy in the art of braiding. "Daniel, you're pulling it!" she squealed through laughter. "Not on purpose," he grinned, tangling another strand. Kaiser lay nearby, ears twitching at every giggle, his presence steady as stone. "Try it like this," Sophie demonstrated with nimble fingers, guiding him. At last, a crooked braid formed. She beamed. Not bad. For a beginner. You're officially allowed in my salon. Daniel chuckled. High praise. Her grin turned mischievous. Oh, I'll make you, Daddy. The word landed with quiet force, spoken naturally, without hesitation. Daniel's throat tightened. He pulled her into a hug, Kaiser nudging his nose against them both, as if sealing the moment. Later came homework. Sophie sat at the wooden table, pencils spread. Daniel sipped coffee across from her, helping with fractions. No traps this time, he promised. She giggled. Like last time? Exactly like last time. Kaiser curled beneath her chair, tail thumping whenever she bent to scratch his ears. She whispered secrets into his fur, and he answered with soft whuffs and sighs. Watching them, Daniel felt peace settle in, a reminder that family was built in small, deliberate acts. As night deepened, Sophie asked for a story. Daniel read aloud while she nestled against him. Kaiser pressed between them in a circle of warmth. Her eyelids drooped, pencil slipping from her hand. He carried her to bed, tucking her in with quiet care. Kaiser lay at the mattress edge, eyes sharp, as if promising never to leave her side. Daniel brushed her hair back. We'll keep building this, every day, in every little thing. I promise. The cabin hushed, filled only with the crackle of fire and the river's lull. Healing didn't roar tonight. It whispered, steady as breath. At dawn, mist clung to the riverbank. Coffee in hand, Daniel stepped outside and froze. Footprints pressed deep into damp earth, leading from the woods toward the cabin. Kaiser stiffened, hackles raised, a growl rumbling low. Daniel crouched, tracing the impressions. Too heavy, too deliberate. Not Miriam or Rick. Someone else. Someone who moved with intent. Someone's watching, he muttered. Kaiser's gaze locked on the tree line, ears sharp, body braced. Minutes later, the sheriff's truck crunched up the dirt path. Briggs climbed out, coat collar high, eyes scanning the prints. He knelt, jaw tightening. Not them, but one of their crew, maybe. Men like that don't vanish. They linger. They wait. Daniel's fists clenched. Retaliation? Or scouting? Briggs said grimly. Either way, they know you're here. Sophie slept inside, curled against Kaiser's blanket hours before. Daniel's gut twisted. She needed safety, not shadows stalking her doorstep. We can't tell her, he said quietly. She needs to feel secure. I'll put deputies on patrol, Briggs promised. Discreet. But you stay sharp, Daniel. Daniel's eyes swept the cabin, every lock, every window. The Marine in him surged forward, calculated, precise. No one touches her, not now, not ever. Kaiser sat tall beside him, amber eyes fixed on the tree line. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's head. You and me, buddy. We'll be ready. The vow passed between them, silent but ironclad. That evening, Daniel checked the perimeter again. Rain had blurred the prints, but their warning remained. Shadows might wait, but so would he. Inside, Sophie hummed at her sketchbook, unaware. Kaiser's growl echoed softly in the night, a promise of vigilance. Later, Briggs called. One of Rick's men had been spotted near town, asking questions. The threat was real. Daniel leaned against the cabin wall, eyes on the mist curling over the river. Vigilance, he realized, was not punishment. It was love. Unyielding, steadfast, loyal as the dog at his side. "No one touches her," he whispered into the cold air. Kaiser's growl rose again, deep and certain. And in that vow, carved into mist and silence, a fragile new life stood defended. The morning sun brushed frost with gold as Daniel stood in the clearing behind the cabin, Kaiser poised at his side. The leash hung loose in his hand. This wasn't routine exercise, it was preparation. The footprints they'd found near the woods were a reminder. Shadows still lingered. "All right, buddy," Daniel said softly, crouching to meet the shepherd's eyes. "New alert. No barking. Quiet, controlled. Just a nose tap." Kaiser's tail flicked once, amber eyes gleaming with understanding. Daniel held out a cloth ball. "Tap it." The dog nudged it gently. "Yes," Daniel grinned. From the porch, Sophie clapped. "He's the smartest dog in Montana." Her pride swelled through the crisp morning air. Daniel set up drills. 1 tap for an intruder, 2 for danger close. Kaiser moved with precision, silent and exact. Sophie recorded each result in a small notebook, her eyes bright with hope. "He's going to protect me forever, isn't he?" Daniel brushed her hair back. "Forever. You and him. We're a team." Hours passed in drills, Kaiser adapting quickly. By afternoon, he was flawless, silent, disciplined, and watchful. Sophie hugged him tight. "You're amazing. I'm so glad you're mine." Daniel knelt beside them, heart swelling. Each tap of Kaiser's nose was more than obedience. It was a promise of safety. That evening, Sophie curled in bed with Kaiser's body wrapped around her like armor. Daniel lingered at the door, remembering the nights she had endured hunger and neglect. Her small voice broke the silence. "Promise you won't leave like before." Daniel crossed the room, cupping her face. "Sophie, my only mission now is you." Kaiser nudged her with his nose, sealing the vow. Sophie clutched both man and dog, her tears soaking Daniel's shirt. Slowly, her fear unwound. She reached for her notebook. Under the lamp's glow, she drew the cabin, the river, Kaiser watchful, and Daniel standing protectively beside them. At the bottom, she scrawled, "The night we found our family again." Daniel's throat tightened. It was more than a sketch. It was a declaration. He kissed her hair. "We're a team. Always." Outside, the pines whispered, but inside the cabin there was warmth, vigilance, and the fragile beginning of trust. Moonlight spilled silver across the cabin floor when Daniel woke to a soft nudge at his knee. Kaiser stood at the door, bristling but silent, the nose tap. Daniel pulled on his jacket, crouched low. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd's ears locked toward the shed. A figure crouched there, one of Rick Dalton's men, clutching papers. Daniel and Kaiser moved in silence, shadows blending with shadows. From Sophie's window, her eyes widened, but Daniel raised a calming hand. "Stay inside." He crept closer, flashlight ready. Kaiser's tap on his leg signaled it was time. Daniel's voice rang steady. "Rivers, step away from the papers." The intruder froze, startled. Headlights flared from the tree line. Sheriff Briggs's truck grinding up the gravel. The sheriff climbed out, shotgun leveled. The man's grip faltered. The papers fluttered to the ground. Deeds, transfers, evidence of Miriam and Rick's schemes. Kaiser flanked him, body low, silent authority radiating from every line of muscle. "Hands where I can see them," Briggs barked. The intruder raised his arms. In moments, he was cuffed, evidence secure. Daniel exhaled, picking up the fallen documents. Sophie peeked from the doorway, eyes wide. He mouthed the words she needed most. Safe, All safe. Kaiser pressed close to her feet, a living shield. Briggs led the man away. Daniel crouched, rubbing Kaiser's ears. Good boy. Mission complete. The night resumed its rhythm, no longer threatening, but calm, silver moonlight glinting off frost. Inside, Sophie finally loosened her grip on her blanket. Daniel kissed her forehead. Sleep now. We've got this. Always. Kaiser curled at her side, silent and steady. Outside, danger might still stir, but here, 3 hearts, child, man, and dog, rested unbroken, vigilant, and whole. The morning sun spilled through the tall, arched windows of the Riverton County Courthouse, casting golden stripes across the polished oak benches. The townsfolk filled the gallery in tense silence, whispers of curiosity and hope floating like dust in the air. At the front, Sophie sat in a sky-blue dress, a small figure of innocence against the heavy wood and solemn walls. Her hand rested on Kaiser's broad back, the shepherd's chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his amber eyes scanning the room. Beside her, Daniel stood at the witness box, tie slightly crooked, but shoulders squared, his face calm and his voice steady. I met Sophie in a house that should have been safe, Daniel began. But what I found was cruelty disguised as care. She lived under fear and manipulation. Miriam and Rick Dalton treated her not as a child, but as leverage. His gaze flicked to Sophie. She looked down quickly, burying her face in Kaiser's fur. One by one, the truth unfolded. Martha Quinn testified, her quiet strength filling the room as she spoke of hidden pawn slips, stolen support money, and nights she'd left food on her porch to keep Sophie from starving. Sheriff Briggs followed, his low, steady voice detailing the evidence recovered, the arrests made, and the deputies who had worked tirelessly to ensure Sophie's safety. Judge Evelyn Hart listened with deliberate calm, her hands folded, her eyes sharp, but patient. No one doubted her authority, but more than that, they trusted her fairness. When the prosecutor summarized the case, documents, recordings, testimony, the conclusion was inescapable. At last, Judge Hart leaned forward. The room held its breath. This court finds Miriam Dalton and Rick Dalton guilty of fraud, neglect, and the endangerment of a minor. They are sentenced to the maximum extent of the law. Sophie gasped softly, clutching Kaiser with both arms. The dog pressed closer, a living wall of safety. Daniel knelt at her side, whispering, "From now on, no one touches you. Not ever again." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. For Sophie, it was the sound of chains breaking. As the courtroom emptied, sunlight streamed brighter through the windows, as though the town itself exhaled relief. Outside, the courthouse steps glowed with morning light. Sophie walked slowly, Kaiser glued to her side. At the bottom of the steps, she tugged Daniel's hand, her voice small but sure. "I'm really safe now, aren't I?" Daniel crouched, meeting her eyes. "Yes, Sophie. You're safe. And you always will be." She buried her face in Kaiser's neck, and the shepherd's tail thumped once, a quiet affirmation. Around them, townsfolk whispered, some ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner, others moved by the courage of a child who had endured so much. Sheriff Briggs stepped past with the cuffed Daltons in tow, his expression hard, but his words soft enough for Sophie to hear. "It's over, kiddo. They can't touch you again." Daniel placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "It's done," he said, and for the first time in years, he believed it. Days later, the gravel drive of the cabin filled with the hum of engines and the crunch of footsteps. Riverton had come, not with gossip, but with casseroles, pies, wind chimes, and lilac bushes. Neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains now stepped forward, shy but sincere. Mrs. Langley handed Sophie a steaming pie. "For the bravest girl I know." Sophie's eyes lit up, and Kaiser nudged her hand as if to remind her she deserved every kindness. Children hesitated at the yard's edge until Sophie waved them over. Soon, laughter filled the air as Kaiser bounded through the grass, tail whipping like a banner, Sophie chasing beside him with her new friends. The yard, once silent, now rang with joy. Mrs. Carter hung wind chimes on the porch, their gentle song mingling with the river's murmur. "So you'll always remember peace is possible," she told Daniel. He nodded, words caught in his throat, but gratitude plain in his eyes. As the sun dipped low, streaking the sky with amber, Sophie climbed onto the porch beside Daniel, one hand on Kaiser's collar. She looked out at the gathered neighbors, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for letting me have a family." Applause rippled through the crowd, not loud, but reverent. Daniel pulled her into a hug, Kaiser pressing firmly against them both, completing the circle of warmth and protection. For the first time, the cabin felt like more than walls and a roof. It was home. A place sanctified not only by law, but by community, by love freely given, by the loyalty of a dog who had never left her side. As twilight deepened, the chimes sang softly in the breeze. Sophie's laughter mingled with the sound, carried over Willow River, like a benediction. Daniel stood on the porch, watching her run with the other children, Kaiser bounding beside her, and felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace, unshakable and real. The darkness had been defeated. What remained was family. The morning sun spilled across Willow River cabin like liquid gold, bathing the yard in warmth that carried the soft hum of celebration. A banner flapped gently in the breeze above the wooden steps. "Congratulations, Kaiser. K9, good citizen." Sophie clutched the leash in her small, determined hands, her fingers brushing the coarse fur along Kaiser's neck. The German shepherd sat alert, chest heaving slightly, eyes bright and focused, not with anxiety, but with an attentive calm that only comes from months of trust, guidance, and unwavering partnership. Daniel stood to the side, hands resting on the railing of the porch, watching the ceremony with a mix of pride, relief, and the lingering echo of the battles they had survived. He swallowed hard, feeling the familiar sting of tears prick at the corners of his eyes, and quickly wiped them away before Sophie could notice. He had promised her safety, comfort, and a home. Yet it was in moments like this, the quiet acknowledgement of hard-earned triumph, that he realized the depth of their journey. Every lesson, every night of fear, every cautious glance over the shoulder had led to this, a shared victory, sealed not by law or order, but by love, loyalty, and the bond between girl and dog. The small crowd of Riverton residents gathered in the yard clapped and cheered, their faces radiant with the satisfaction of witnessing something beautiful and rare. Mrs. Langley's hands shook slightly as she adjusted her sun hat, tears welling in her eyes, while Sheriff Briggs, usually a stoic presence, offered a small, approving nod. Even Martha, ever vigilant, allowed herself a quiet smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling as she watched Sophie guide Kaiser through the final steps of his test. The ceremony was simple, almost understated, but its weight resonated deeply. This wasn't just about a certificate, a ribbon, or a title. It was about recognition of courage, of resilience, and of a bond that had grown stronger through hardship and unwavering trust. Sophie crouched slightly, meeting Kaiser's gaze directly. "Okay, boy," she whispered, her voice steady, but carrying the unmistakable tremor of emotion. "Let's show them what we've learned." Kaiser's ears twitched. His tail wagged slowly, a measured rhythm that mirrored his calm confidence. Together, they moved through the steps of the K9 Good Citizen evaluation, with a precision that only comes from months of consistent practice and an unspoken understanding. Sit, stay, heal, come. The commands were simple, yet each one spoke volumes of patience, of connection, of a silent dialogue built on love, respect, and mutual reliance. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched, memories of fear and uncertainty flashing briefly behind his eyes. The nights when shadows in the yard had seemed endless. The months of vigilance when every sound could signify danger. The trembling silence of Sophie's small voice as she whispered, "Promise you won't leave me." Those moments, so heavy with tension and heartbreak, now felt like distant echoes, replaced by this scene of accomplishment and joy. He exhaled, allowing himself a small, unguarded smile as Kaiser completed the final step. Returning to Sophie's side with effortless obedience, tail high, eyes gleaming with pride. "Excellent," the evaluator said, a warm smile on her face as she handed Sophie the certificate. "Kaiser is officially a K9 Good Citizen." Sophie's small hands gripped the paper, as if it were more than a piece of parchment, as if it were a tangible representation of her entire journey, her triumph over fear, and the steadfast presence of her guardian and companion. The Kaiser nudged her gently with his snout, a silent acknowledgement, a wordless "I did it too." Sophie laughed, a sound that danced like wind chimes in the morning air, and leaned down to hug him, wrapping her arms around his sturdy neck. Kaiser lowered his massive head to rest against her shoulder, a perfect mirror of trust and devotion. Daniel stepped forward, bending slightly to wrap his arms around Sophie and Kaiser together. The three of them formed a tableau of unity, girl, dog, and guardian, bound not only by circumstance but by choice. He pressed a kiss to Sophie's hair, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo, a touchstone of innocence and resilience. "I'm so proud of both of you," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly with the weight of everything that had led them here. Sophie looked up at him, eyes shimmering, and smiled. A smile so full of faith, hope, and unconditional trust that Daniel felt his heart swell beyond containment. The neighbors erupted into applause again, not for the certificate itself, but for the visible healing of a family, for the courage it took to rebuild a life after trauma, and for the reminder that love, quiet, persistent, patient love, could mend even the most frayed bonds. One by one, they approached to shake hands, offer hugs, and bring small gifts. A hand-knit blanket for Sophie, a new chew toy for Kaiser, a basket of cookies for all three. Every gesture was a blessing, a public affirmation that Riverton now claimed them fully as a family, deserving of care, respect, and shared joy. Sophie ran to Daniel, dragging the certificate behind her, and climbed into his arms. "We did it, Daniel. We really did it," she exclaimed, laughter bubbling through the words. Kaiser jumped up beside them, front paws resting on Daniel's shoulder, eyes glinting with excitement. The sight of the three together, triumphant and unbroken, struck a chord in everyone present, a living emblem of resilience, loyalty, and the transformative power of unwavering companionship. As the morning stretched into noon, the celebration continued with gentle laughter, shared stories, and quiet pride. Daniel watched Sophie and Kaiser playfully chase each other around the yard. the kind of joyous energy that comes only when fear has finally been replaced by security. He marveled at the strength of their bond, understanding in the depths of his being that this was more than a certificate, more than a ceremony. It was the sealing of a promise, that they would face the world together, unflinching, unshakable, and forever connected. For Daniel, Sophie, and Kaiser, the day marked more than recognition. It marked completion and continuity. The bond between them had been tested in darkness, forged in trials, and now celebrated in light. The certificate would hang on a wall in the cabin, a symbol not just of accomplishment but of survival, healing, and the enduring power of love and loyalty. In Riverton, the little family stood whole, their hearts intertwined, ready to embrace whatever came next, not alone, but together. The Willow River flowed like molten silver beneath the late afternoon sun, casting ripples of light across the wooden dock that stretched lazily from the cabin's edge. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the gentle scent of pine, earth, and the quiet reassurance of a life rebuilt. Inside the cabin, the warm glow of the fire painted the room in golden hues, flickering across the worn wooden floorboards and illuminating the familiar chaos of a home finally lived in. Books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, pencils scattered across a sketch pad, and the faint aroma of cocoa lingering in the air. Daniel reclined in the leather armchair by the fire, one leg draped over the other, eyes scanning the pages of a book he had promised himself he'd finish one day. But more than the words on the paper, he was aware of the symphony around him. The soft scratch of pencil against paper, the gentle hum of Sophie's breathing, and the deep, rhythmic exhale of Kaiser, curled protectively beside her. The German shepherd's massive body was both a pillow and a shield, a living testament to years of training, trust, and unspoken understanding. Every so often, Kaiser's paw twitched in response to Sophie's gentle movements, a subtle acknowledgement that they were partners in this quiet ritual of domesticity. Sophie's small frame was hunched over a sketchbook on the floor, the paper nearly hidden beneath the flurry of lines, shapes, and colors that poured from her pencil. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, catching the firelight, and Daniel noticed the careful precision with which she shaded Kaiser's fur, capturing the subtle gleam in his eyes, the curve of his muzzle, the way his ears perked ever so slightly at a sound only he seemed to hear. She paused for a moment, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, then whispered, almost to herself, "Because of you, I was never alone." Daniel's chest tightened, and he felt the familiar sting of emotion prick at the corners of his eyes. The words, simple yet profound, resonated deeper than any praise or accolade he had ever received. It wasn't just the promise he had made to protect her. It was the realization that through every trial, every night of fear, every shadow lurking at the edge of their lives, they had protected each other. Sophie had saved him from isolation, from despair, from the quiet ache of a world that sometimes seemed too heavy to bear alone. And Kaiser, with his unwavering presence, his silent alerts, his boundless devotion, had anchored them both, creating a space of safety, trust, and unconditional love. Daniel set his book aside, the weight of it forgotten as he leaned forward to watch them more closely. The scene was intimate, ordinary, yet suffused with a sacred quality that only those who have survived fear and found refuge could truly understand. Sophie looked up from her sketching, eyes meeting his with a spark of mischief and joy. "Look, Daniel, I drew the three of us by the river, the way you said home feels." Her smile was tentative, yet radiant, a reflection of the courage it took to open herself fully to the world again. Kaiser lifted his head momentarily, his gaze following hers, and let out a soft, approving woof that made Sophie giggle. Daniel crossed the room in quiet strides, kneeling beside them. He reached out to touch Sophie's shoulder, then Kaiser's head, feeling the warmth, the weight, and the undeniable presence of his two constant companions. "You know," he said, voice low and tender, "I think I saved you. But you and Kaiser, you've saved me too." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, processing the gravity of his words, and then a gentle laugh escaped her lips, the sound full of light and life. She leaned against him, resting her head briefly on his shoulder before turning to stroke Kaiser's back. Kaiser, ever patient, nuzzled into her hand, the kind of contact that spoke volumes without a single word. Outside, the river murmured along its banks, a constant rhythm that mirrored the steady heartbeat of their home. The walls of the cabin seemed to embrace the three of them, the memories of fear and uncertainty dissolving into the warmth of shared presence and the quiet triumph of survival. Each shadow, once menacing and oppressive, now felt softened by the sunlight spilling through the windows, by the laughter of a child who had learned to trust again, and by the steady companionship of a dog who had never faltered. Sophie returned to her sketching, and Daniel resumed his place by the fire. But the silence that filled the room was not empty. It was rich with the unspoken understanding that life had brought them here, to a place where healing was ongoing, where the bonds of family, chosen, nurtured, and fiercely protected, defined the meaning of home. Every pencil stroke, every page turned, every flicker of firelight reflected the rhythm of their days, quiet, tender, intentional. Kaiser shifted slightly, resting his massive head on Sophie's knee, eyes half closed but alert, a living sentinel, reminding them that love often wears the face of protection. Daniel watched the scene unfold, heart full, and allowed himself to breathe in the serenity that had been so elusive for so long. There would be challenges ahead, moments when shadows might threaten to creep back into their lives. But for now, the river whispered promises of continuity and peace. The cabin stood firm on its foundation. The fire crackled as it had 1,000 nights before, and the trio, bound by choice and loyalty, remained whole. Sophie looked up from her sketchbook once more, holding it out for Daniel to see. The drawing captured the three of them perfectly. Daniel reading by the fire, Sophie sketching on the floor, Kaiser curled faithfully at her side. The caption, written in her small, precise letters, read simply, "Home, by the river." Daniel's throat tightened. He could scarcely imagine a more perfect summary of their journey. He reached out, pulling both Sophie and Kaiser into a gentle embrace, holding them as if to imprint this moment into memory forever. As evening fell, the fire's glow mingled with the fading sunlight, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of warmth and reassurance. Outside, the Willow River continued its eternal course, a quiet witness to the lives it touched. Inside, 3 hearts beat in unison, steady, strong, and unbroken. In this place, this home by the river, Sophie, Daniel, and Kaiser had found not just safety, but belonging, and in each other, the promise that they would never face the world alone again. The evening settled over Willow River with a soft, unhurried grace. The sun sank low, melting behind distant hills, spilling molten gold and rose across the river's surface. The gentle lap of water against the shore harmonized with the soft song of the wind through the cabin's wind chimes, their delicate tinkle rising and falling like a lullaby only nature could compose. Smoke from the cabin's stone chimney spiraled lazily into the fading light, mingling with the faint aroma of pine and earth, a scent that carried the promise of home, safety, and peace. Daniel stood at the edge of the wooden dock, hands resting lightly on the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside him, Sophie leaned against him, her small hand finding his in a gesture of quiet trust. And Kaiser, his massive frame shadowed against the shimmering water, rested at their feet. He was still, his ears pricked to the sounds of the riverbank, alert yet serene. Daniel's gaze drifted from the river to Sophie's face, illuminated by the soft glow of the dying sun, her hair catching firelight in strands of gold and copper. He could see the ease in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed, the faint smile tugging at her lips, unguarded and genuine. A far cry from the cautious, haunted little girl who had once clung to him with fear in her eyes. The air was cool, carrying whispers of distant fields and forests. The kind of evening that seemed suspended between worlds, neither day nor night, yet rich with the weight of everything that had led them here. Daniel could still feel it, the echo of years filled with tension, uncertainty, and the near-constant vigilance demanded by danger. But in this moment, those echoes were distant, almost foreign, as if someone had quietly replaced them with the gentle rhythm of life, finally righted. Sophie shifted slightly, drawing closer to Kaiser, who leaned his head gently against her shoulder. She whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "We're really safe now, aren't we?" Daniel's eyes softened, a small, almost imperceptible nod in response. "Yes," he said simply, voice low, reverent. "We're safe, and we're together. That's what matters." Kaiser lifted his snout slightly, letting out a soft exhale, a contented sigh that seemed to echo Daniel's sentiment. A living testament to loyalty fulfilled, vigilance replaced by trust. The wind played through the willow trees along the riverbank, brushing the tips of their long, hanging leaves against one another, creating a chorus of rustling that was both lively and soothing. Wind chimes on the cabin's porch sang in harmony with the breeze, tiny metal voices celebrating an ordinary evening that felt extraordinary precisely because of what it represented: survival, healing, and the quiet triumph of love over fear. Daniel watched Sophie trace gentle patterns in the wooden planks of the dock with her fingers, the same fingers that had once trembled in terror, now steady and confident. It was in these small motions that the depth of their journey became most tangible. The little rhythms of life that proved resilience, courage, and recovery weren't loud declarations, but quiet, persistent truths. Sophie's gaze lifted to Daniel, her eyes reflecting the sun's golden glow. "You know," she murmured, "I think miracles aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet, like this." Daniel felt a lump in his throat, his chest tightening with an emotion so profound it was almost painful to breathe. He knelt beside her, resting one hand on her back and the other gently stroking Kaiser's head. "You're right," he said. "Not every miracle comes with thunder or fireworks. Some come in moments like this, in loyalty, love, and second chances." He looked down at Kaiser, whose deep brown eyes met his with a knowing calm, a gaze that had seen fear, danger, and loss, yet never wavered in its devotion. Daniel could feel the bond between them, unspoken yet unbreakable, a thread spun from years of shared trials, trust, and an instinctive understanding that went beyond words. And then he looked at Sophie, her small hand brushing Kaiser's fur absent-mindedly. Her body relaxed in the safety of this newfound family, and he realized that the miracle they were witnessing wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about what they had built together. The three of them, together, whole. Daniel leaned back on the dock, feeling the warmth of the fading sun on his face, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He could hear the distant laughter of neighbors who had once rallied to protect them, the soft ripple of water against the pilings, the whispering wind threading through the willow branches, and the subtle, steady breath of Kaiser, sleeping at Sophie's feet. These were the quiet miracles, the moments that didn't announce themselves, but left their mark on the soul. They didn't need fanfare or recognition. They simply existed, and that was enough. Sophie, her head resting lightly against Daniel's arm, drew her knees to her chest, sketchbook open on her lap. She began to draw, the pencil moving with deliberate care, capturing the three of them, the river, the dock, the willow trees, the warm light of the cabin, and the shadowed figures of Daniel and Kaiser at her side. She titled the page simply, "The Quiet Miracle." It wasn't a loud claim, nor a dramatic proclamation, but in that title lay the entire story of their journey. The suffering endured, the fear survived, the loyalty upheld, and the love that had stitched their hearts together again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and amber, Daniel held Sophie close, Kaiser resting his head against her knees, their silhouettes framed against the soft, flowing river. The world beyond this small cabin might still contain shadows, dangers, and unknown trials, but in this moment, it was irrelevant. They had each other. They had home, and they had the knowledge that miracles, even the quietest ones, had the power to reshape lives entirely. The wind chimes sang once more, and Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for fame, nor fortune, nor accolades, but for this, the gentle, steadfast presence of two beings who had saved him in ways he could never have anticipated. He pressed a kiss to Sophie's hair and whispered softly, "Thank you, both of you, for every moment, for every heartbeat, for being here." Kaiser let out a low, contented sigh, tail brushing the wooden planks in a slow, rhythmic sweep. Sophie leaned back against Daniel, closing her eyes for a brief, unguarded moment, and the three of them simply existed, bound by choice, loyalty, and love. The river reflected their silhouettes, golden and steadfast, a quiet testament to survival, hope, and the enduring magic of second chances. In the soft twilight, they were whole, and sometimes, Daniel thought, that was the greatest miracle of all. Stories like Daniel, Sophie, and Kaiser remind us of something timeless, the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a German shepherd, the way a dog can sense our fears, our joys, and stay beside us through it all. It's in the gentle nudge, the soft gaze, the shared moments of comfort that the deepest bonds are formed. Animals teach us about patience, trust, and love that asks for nothing but presence in return. Watching Kaiser protect and guide Sophie and the way he became both guardian and companion shows that these connections are more than just companionship. They're lifelines, bridges between hearts. In every wag, every alert, and every quiet moment together, there's a reminder that love isn't always loud, but it's always felt. If you've ever wondered how to connect more deeply with your own dog, there are thoughtful resources out there, guides, tips, and stories from people who've nurtured these extraordinary bonds. One I've found particularly meaningful is Insert link here. It's gentle, insightful, and full of ways to strengthen the trust and love you share with your dog. Consider it a little companion on your journey, as caring and steady as the dog sitting quietly by your side.